Hey J-Team students, you're going to be listening to and watching a Ruby Bridges and Civil Rights slideshow. So you're going to need to have obviously headphones on. You need your note organizer that on the top says Ruby Bridges and the Civil Rights slideshow. It has a column for slide number, answering the question, and recording your thoughts and feelings. So when you see each slide, there's going to be a question on the top. So you want to be thinking of that question as you're taking your bullet notes and as you're recording your thoughts, feelings, and your reactions with bullet notes. You want to be as specific as you can because you are going to be working on a writing project when you're done. So the more specific your notes, the easier it's going to be for you to do some writing. So let's start with slide number 1. Who is Ruby Bridges? So I'm going to have you listen, and again, you can pause at any time. On November 14th, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Bridges started first grade at William Frantz Public School in New Orleans. The seemingly ordinary act was, in fact, historic. Ruby and 3 other girls were the first African-American students to integrate all-white schools in New Orleans. Ruby was the only African-American student who went to William Frantz Public School. Ruby's world was quite different from the world we live in today. In the South, African-American students and white students went to separate schools because of segregation policies. During the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement was calling attention to the problem of segregation and the broader issues of racism and inequality that, under the law, resulted in African Americans being denied basic rights. Ruby stepped into history and became an icon of the civil rights movement by bravely integrating her school. So now you're going to go over and to your notes. You want to make sure you're pausing this as you're writing. You're going to write down that slide number, which is 1. You're going to answer the question, who is Ruby Bridges? And again, you can go back and listen again if you'd like to, and then record your thoughts and your feelings. When you're done with your writing, you're going to move on to the next slide. So you're going to want to pause or even rewind at this point. Slide 2, what was segregation? So looking at this map, what do you notice? What's this a map of? Okay, you're going to notice the color coding as well. You'll want to go on over to the key so you know exactly what the orange represents. And then I'm going to go ahead and give you some information about what was segregation. Separating people based on the color of their skin is called segregation. Segregation existed in the United States for decades after slavery ended. Racist laws and policies treated African Americans as second-class citizens and separated African Americans and whites. These types of laws became known as the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws existed in states in the South of and including Virginia. The term Jim Crow was a rude, uncomplimentary way of referring to black people. So again, you're going to want to go back, you're going to want to rewind, listen again, take your notes by adding the slide number, bullet notes, answering the question, what was segregation, based on the information I just gave you, and then writing down thoughts, feelings, and reactions. So you'll rewind and listen and take notes at this point. All right, slides 3, 4, and 5. So on your chart, you're going to group these together. So in one box, you're going to write 3, 4, and 5. And you're going to be listening for life during segregation. Segregation affected people's daily lives. For example, African Americans and whites used different water fountains and bathrooms. They had separate waiting rooms and seating sections on public transportation, such as buses. Baseball leagues were either all African American or all white. The effect of segregation was to make it seem as though African Americans were inferior to other people. So again, rewind, listen, take your notes. Slide 6. What is Plessy versus Ferguson? The Jim Crow laws had their legal foundation in Plessy versus Ferguson, the ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. The ruling said that dividing citizens by race was constitutional if the separate facilities were considered equal. The ruling legalized segregation and introduced the legal idea of separate but equal. So if you take a look at the picture, you'll notice all African American children. So supposedly that classroom is separate, but it's equal. Slide 7. What is Brown versus Board of Education? In 1954, the Supreme Court said in the case of Brown versus Board of Education that separating students by race created educational facilities that were unequal. Therefore, segregation laws and policies violated the 14th Amendment, which prohibits states from denying citizens their civil liberties and equal protection under the law. The ruling had the effect of desegregating public schools in the United States. So in the picture, Thurgood Marshall, he's the center in the photo, was the attorney who successfully argued the landmark case against segregation, along with George E.C. Hayes on the left and James Nabrit Jr. to the right. Marshall later became the first African-American justice of the Supreme Court. So what is Brown versus Board of Education? Take your notes and move on. Slides 8 and 9. How did the states react to integration? In parts of the South, state governments refused to enforce the federal ruling. In Virginia, some schools even closed to avoid integrating. In 1957, in Arkansas, 9 African-American students integrated the all-white Central High School in Little Rock. Anti-integration protesters surrounded the school, and the governor sent the Arkansas State Militia to blockade the school, refusing entry to 9 students. President Eisenhower ordered federal troops to protect Elizabeth Eckford, shown in slide 8, so that would be the top slide, and Melba Patillo and 7 other students who were able to integrate the school. So how did the states react to integration? So when you're looking at the photos, what are you seeing in the background? All right, slide 10. What was the Civil Rights Movement? The Brown versus Board of Education ruling came in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a mass protest movement across the United States that aimed to stop racial segregation, the discrimination, and disenfranchisement of African Americans. The movement reached its peak in the 50s and 60s and was characterized by civil disobedience and nonviolent protests, such as boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and other leaders and activists, as well as thousands of ordinary people, took part in the protests. So what was the Civil Rights Movement? All right, slide 11. Who was Rosa Parks? As a result of her nonviolent resistance to segregation laws in Alabama, Rosa Parks became a civil rights activist and was known as the mother of the freedom movement. On December 1st, 1955, Parks was riding a Montgomery bus home from work. She was seated in the African American section of the segregated bus. Her seat was in the row closest to the white section of seating, which was full. When several more white passengers boarded the bus driver ordered Parks and 3 other African American passengers to move back. Parks refused, and the bus driver had her arrested for violating segregation laws. So again, who was Rosa Parks? So you want to stop, rewind, take your notes. Slide 12. Describe the Montgomery bus boycott. The arrest of Rosa Parks marked the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, a 381-day mass protest against the segregated bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. On December 5th, African American residents stopped using Montgomery public bus systems, causing it to lose 75% of its riders. Impressed by this success, local civil rights leaders encouraged the boycott. They also filed a federal lawsuit against bus segregation. On June 5, 1956, a federal district court decided that segregated bus seating was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court agreed in November of 1956, and buses were legally desegregated on December 20th, 1956. Slide 13, which should look familiar. Describe civil disobedience and how it related to the lunch counter sit-ins. Other protests focused on lunch counters and restaurants in the South, which had refused for years to serve African American customers. Protesters organized sit-ins, during which civil rights activists, both African American and white, gathered in groups to sit at lunch counters for hours. They were denied service, but took up seats that could have been filled by paying customers. In September 1959, students held a sit-in at Grant's department store in Miami, shown here in the picture, that lasted for weeks. The restaurant decided to close rather than serve African Americans. Activists in the South took note of the nonviolent action in Miami and began holding their own sit-ins, including the one at the Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. And that lunch counter sit-in was initiated by those Greensboro 4. All right, slide 14. Why did Ruby's parents choose an all-white school for her? The civil rights movement was growing stronger and laws were changing, but by the late 1950s, many schools in the South still had not integrated. Many white people didn't want integration, and the state governments were not enforcing the federal rule. Finally, a federal court ruled that New Orleans schools would have to integrate by 1960. In kindergarten, Ruby had attended an all-African-American school. She had many friends and an African-American teacher. She loved school. Then Ruby passed an entrance exam that was the Anti-Integration School Board. They designed it so African-American children would fail with the aim of keeping them out of all-white schools. Well, guess what? Ruby passed it. So after the integration ruling, Ruby passed the exam, and Ruby's parents had a choice where to send her to school. And the NAACP encouraged them to send Ruby to the all-white school. They thought it would be a better school, and then they thought that she'd be helping children by integrating schools. Ruby's father wasn't so sure his daughter should go. He wanted to protect Ruby from angry people, and Ruby's mother, Lucille, wanted her daughter to have better opportunities. Eventually, Ruby's parents decided she would go to the William Frantz Elementary School. In November 1960, Ruby and 6 other students integrated New Orleans elementary schools. Ruby was the only African-American student at William Frantz Elementary. Slide 15. What was the job of the marshals? People in the city of New Orleans were angry at the schools that were being forced to integrate. And Judge J. Skelly Wright, the federal judge who ordered the schools to integrate, was worried about the student safety. He asked the federal government for U.S. Marshals to protect the students. On her first day of school, and for months after, the marshals escorted Ruby into William Frantz Elementary. Slide 16 and 17. White protesters boycotted the school, and what does that exactly mean? Anti-integration protesters lined up outside of Ruby's school. The police kept them behind barricades. In her book, Through My Eyes, Ruby remembers that they were very loud, like the city's residents were during Mardi Gras. The protests continued into the spring. Marshals escorted Ruby to school throughout that time. The white protesters also wanted to make sure white families boycotted the school. On Ruby's first day, white parents came to pull their children out of the integrated school. Slide 18. Describe Mrs. Henry. Ruby's teacher, Barbara Henry, was young, white, and from Boston. Ruby had never spent that much time with a white person before. Ruby's first grade experience was unique. She was in a classroom by herself because white parents didn't want their children in class with an African-American student. Ruby spent all of her time with Mrs. Henry, and they became very close. Strong anti-integration protests and rioting in New Orleans died down by the end of the school year. And in second grade, Ruby was in a classroom with other students, including white children. Ruby graduated from William Frantz Elementary School and eventually high school in New Orleans. Today, she gives speeches about the experiences she had during the civil rights movement. Slide 19. I Have a Dream. What was it about? Desegregation continued in the South, and the civil rights movement carried on in the early 1960s. Martin Luther King Jr., the most famous civil rights leader, advocated civil disobedience and nonviolent protest to fight racism and discrimination. His most famous speech about racial equality, I Have a Dream, was delivered in Washington, D.C. in 1963. All right, your last slide, slide 20. Describe the Civil Rights Act. So the Civil Rights Act, what I'd like for you to do is just kind of take a look at the picture, see what's going on, and in your own words, what do you think the Civil Rights Act means? Jot down any notes. All right, once you're done jotting notes, the next part is to take a look at your informational essay directions. The screen here is not large enough, so I'm going to actually have you go back to my webpage, my teacher page, and there's going to be another link, and the link is going to say Informational Essay Directions for the Civil Rights Slideshow. So once you're done taking all of your notes from these slides, I want you to go back to my teacher page, and it's going to be a clearer version of what to do next.